So we all know that hemp is utilized for food, fuel, and fiber. But in the world that we live in today, as I said, it's also utilized for other things. Cannabidiol, CBD, okay? And what's really important to make a note of is that CBD is being utilized as a drug, okay? If you go to PubMed, which is one of the largest resources for medical journals and peer-reviewed works and different studies, and you type in cannabidiol, you will find over 2,000 different search results about CBD being utilized as a medicine, which means it's being utilized as a drug.
Which means you can't call both the narrow leaf types, one which is hemp and the other cannabis type that gets you high, you can't both consider them drug. Yeah. And that's where I said, well, why don't we separate the two between the psychoactive one and the non-psychoactive type? Because, right, hemp is not psychoactive, except people think of the word psychoactive meaning something that makes you feel high. Where what Brandon helped me realize was that really the definition of psychoactive just means an ability to pass through the blood-brain barrier and modulate brain chemistry somehow, some way. And that's true. So you can't call the hemp type NLH, and you can't call the drug type
That gets you high.
NLD. You can't call them both NLD, even though we now know that they're both drugs. So what are we going to call this?
Well, this is where we went back and forth for quite some time.
About a month.
Yeah.
2 hours a day.
And this is, it's probably even more than that, because I woke up at 3 a.m. many of days trying to think of the word that we could use that does not omit hemp as being a drug, because it is. So we had to find something else to not just say drug over here.
And we debated probably in the neighborhood of 20 to 30 words for about 30 days.
Down, yeah.
And we literally had screaming matches over the phone, wrestling what makes sense based on fact, reality,
and history,
and history, and all these things. What could we call cannabis, the kind that makes you high, that's separate from hemp? What could we use as a word for that?
And we stumbled across an article from The Verge magazine, and the title itself, I think, was something along the lines of marijuana is not a bad word. And we're like, that's the word. This is the word that we've been looking for. We call this plant that gets you high marijuana all the time. And I was just kind of blown away of how simple it was to be able to find the word we were looking for. But we have a couple issues, because there's different perspectives of what marijuana means.
In fact, I freaked out. I was like, you want to call it what? Oh, hell no, you are not calling it the M word. Because for 10 years, I've told the whole world that the M word is a bad word, because I had this understanding that was actually cannabis misinformation.
Yeah.
And believe it or not, I feel like a lot of high-level people in the cannabis industry have the same misunderstanding that I had. And I kind of needed a re-education on this word called marijuana.
And that's what this article talked about, of this history of the word. And it just so happened to quote someone who is sitting with us today, who was discussing how marijuana is not a bad word, and here's why. And Professor Santiago, I'll let you be the one to explain this to the world, because I think that this is so important for, just start talking.
No, you know what?
It's a fascinating story.
It is important. And just real quick, before you go into it, we were just in Oregon teaching this class, and the dispensary owner comes up to me and says, we just convinced the city to stop using the word marijuana because we told them it's a bad word. And so now the cannabis industry itself is really taking this idea that I subscribed to, and they're really running with it. And so if it's true that the word marijuana isn't a bad word, now's the time to teach all of us where this word comes from, what does it mean, is it bad, is it racist? Can you please tell us what the history of the word marijuana is.
When we think about the term marijuana, right, and we think about the term cannabis, they don't necessarily have to be interchangeable, right? Because cannabis is, as we've been alluding to in this first segment, right, it's all of it, right? Yeah. It's the whole family. But how do you parse out the particularities of the differences that we're now having to grapple with, right, as part of an industry? We have different types of effects that this sort of family of plants, right, can produce. And you're trying to really pinpoint what those differences are based off of the leaf structure, right, as we've noted, but also the other sort of effects, right, and where hemp has to be sort of maintained, and then the alternative term should potentially be something that we're all familiar with, right? And in fact, most of our programs are called medical marijuana programs around the U.S., right?
Even if it's recreational, it's retail marijuana.
And so it's not a term that isn't in the lexicon of the industry, right? It's apparent that we are, at least in some ways, comfortable with the term, or at least familiar with it, right? Sure. The issue comes when the industry starts to say it is a word that shouldn't be employed because it's racist.
Right. Which is what I thought.
Yeah. And the term itself is not racist. It's the feelings that you invoke when you use a term that can be racist, right? So if I'm trying to say something negative about individuals, I can invoke the term in a negative way. In the same way, I can sort of recapture that term to mean something like what y'all are trying to accomplish, right? But to give you a sense of where the term really originates, and actually how it enters our vocabulary and why it becomes so important to actually continue to use it, is you have to go back to the colonization of the Americas even before the United States. The original 13 colonies actually get colonized, because most of the colonization of the Americas doesn't begin in the United States, right? The contemporary United States Northeast, right? It begins in the Caribbean, and it begins in what is today Mexico. As part of that colonization project, we talked a little bit about maritime exploration and how most of our seafaring voyages were fueled using hemp, right, to create fibers that ended up being in sails and ended up being in ropes that were used for maritime exploration. Part of the project of Spanish colonization meant bringing hemp plants into the Americas to be able to grow them for those very purposes, right? Because at that moment, as the Spanish colonists are arriving in the Caribbean and in Mexico, there's already an effort to try to stimulate this sort of cross-Atlantic trade. We're entering into this new area where we have all these new goods that we can send back to Europe, right? We have all new flora that we're encountering: tomatoes, potatoes, avocados, corn, right? And there's an effort to try to move these products back and forth. Well, if you only have hemp, right, available for the production of these products that are fueling that maritime trade, that's going to be problematic, because you're having to bring any sails, any ropes with you.
You have to go back.
Yeah, and you have to go back. So why not start producing them in the Americas?
And it was the Spaniards during this time that was originally occupying this region. Yes. And I just wanted to make that clear, that it was the Spaniards.
Yeah, the Spaniards are coming in into especially Mexico, and this is where the term marijuana becomes really apparent and starts to really enter our vocabulary. As the Spanish are arriving, you have to also remember the fact that they're coming from a moment in European history that involves the Inquisition, where the Spanish monarchs are basically trying to turn this area in the Iberian Peninsula into a Catholic sort of nation, right? And so they launched this Inquisition 100 years before they start to really move into the Americas. So they've gone through the process of pushing out Jewish individuals from the peninsula. They've pushed out Muslim individuals from the peninsula. So they have a really strict understanding of religious practice. And part of arriving in the Americas is that they have this whole new population of individuals to Christianize. And part of that process really comes to a head with the use of psychoactive plants, right? Because one thing that's often not considered is that the Americas, and especially Mexico, has a wide array at that time, and still to this day, of psychoactive plants, right? Things that we're familiar with now, like peyote, right?
Datura, belladonna.
Morning glories.
Yeah.
And then also mushrooms, psychoactive mushrooms, like psilocybin.
Mexico has a whole hub of psychoactive native plants.
Yes, and
Just plants in general, I mean, but especially those. I mean, you identify psychoactive plants when we're walking around San Diego.
Right.
So you go a little further south into these various regions.
But you know what? Like, when you get into Europe, I mean, how many natural plants in Europe are psychoactive versus where these native peoples come from?
Yeah.
They really develop
significantly more.
It's a big deal. So, anyways, I like where this is going.
Yeah, and feel free to pop in with questions. But the important thing was that these indigenous communities in Mesoamerica, right? People like the Maya, people like where the community that's known as the Aztec, Mazatec, the Huichol, they all developed these strong cultural practices and ceremonial practices around the ritual consumption of these psychoactive plants, right? And so when the Spanish arrived, one of the biggest issues around really trying to Christianize these populations was the fact that here come these European individuals with this idea to try to sell, right? And they're trying to say, look, God is this infallible being that sort of is all around us, and he can make you feel all these great things, right? And if you're familiar with the Eucharist and the sort of transubstantiation where a small drop of wine is meant to signify the blood of Christ and a piece of unleavened bread is supposed to signify the body of Jesus Christ, that's supposed to mean something for the person consuming it and make you feel these great sensations, right? The issue was that these indigenous people already had a practice very similar, but what they were consuming actually had an effect on their person, right?
And when they tried the blood in the body, and they were like, "Nope, I still feel sober. Yeah. Where's the body and the blood at?"
Yeah, and part of the really important conceptualization that many of these indigenous communities had about plants were that they really conceptualized these plants themselves as having these godlike qualities, right? And so when you consume, when you consume peyote, you're consuming a sort of, the best way to frame it is that it's like consuming an ancestor, a god, and a plant at the same time.
Grandfather spirit.
Yeah, and so when you consume that, and it produces these psychoactive sensations, you can say, oh, this is something meaningful, right? When you introduce a new practice, as the Spanish did, that didn't have that same effect, right? And you're comparing between the two, well, you're not going to want to adopt these religious practices that are trying to be introduced to you if they don't have any significant impact on you as a person.
That makes so much sense.
And what ended up happening as a result is that the Spanish, using the model of the Inquisition, basically said, okay, the only way we're going to be able to Christianize these individuals is if we heavily police their consumption of these psychoactive plants.
That sounds like a prohibition.
Yep, it's exactly what it was. The first prohibition on these sort of psychoactive plants. Wow. And so in so doing that, what ended up taking place is here are the Spanish saying, give us all your psychoactive plants. If we see you consuming these things, right, you're going to be punished. Start to adopt these Christian practices, or else you will also be punished. Wow. And then the last piece of the puzzle, here's this plant, not this one exactly as we noted, but here's this cannabis plant. We need you to grow it for us, right? So that we can be able to produce this food, fuel, and fiber, right? And in the process, we start to see these indigenous communities start to experiment with the plant that they're supposed to work with, and eventually stumble upon an ability to exchange cannabis for these plants that have been taken away from them, right? Now, you can't do that seamlessly while being Christianized if you don't have a coded language for how to talk about that, the fact that you're still engaging in psychoactive plant consumption. And so what they had to do is start to use these sort of Christian-oriented naming practices to be able to hide their consumption of psychoactive plants, right? And so, and it starts with the introduction of cannabis, where they start to give these plants names like Doña Maria, right? Maria Juana.
Can you say it slower?
Doña Maria. So it means like it's a revered. Doña is, it's sort of like an address that is meant to imply a level of respect, right? You can be a don or a doña, and then it sort of modifies Maria, which is
Mother Mary.
Yeah, Mother Mary, and which the Mary figure became really essential in helping to Christianize the indigenous communities of Mexico because of the apparition of the Virgen de Guadalupe, which is a Mary version that appears in Mexico in the early 1500s. And so those names started to get used and coded to be able to talk about these psychoactive plant consumptions. And you start to see it also eventually once they realize they can get away with consuming cannabis using these sort of like concealing mechanisms, then they start to reincorporate a lot of the prohibited substances like psilocybin mushrooms, like peyote, and those plants also start to be reclaimed using these sort of Christianized names, right?
So as long as the plant that you were engaging in as a Christian by considering that plant of Mary, well, this is kosher. This is cool.
Okay. Well, part of it was that it was a way to hide it, right? So the Spanish actually weren't able to see these practices. They would see, for example, right, indigenous communities gathering together and engage in ceremonies.
And the ceremony was a Mary-based ceremony.
Yeah, it was Christianity. It was Catholicism.
And this is where we get this sort of syncretic, especially in Mexico, this sort of syncretism around indigenous sort of spiritual practices and Christian spiritual practices, right? Where if you go into Mexico and you see celebrations like the Day of the Dead, or you see sort of Christian practices, they don't necessarily look the way they would look in Italy or in these other places because they have elements of that indigenous tradition sort of melded in from that sort of colonial period.
So the indigenous people were forced to adopt Christianity. They were forced to cultivate a new plant, and they were forced to stop cultivating plants that they had been using for who knows how long. And in this same time period, they realized that much like other practices like tobacco, and I'm sure other leaves which they would smoke, they found that this cannabis plant that was used for food, fuel, and fiber, but most likely had some elements of THC as well, even if it was minute amounts. It wasn't the normal hemp of what we look at as today with 0.3%.
And that's a United States definition of hemp.
Of
is
hemp,
cannabis being 0.3% or less. Like in China, their hemp plants are 15% THC.
Yeah. So they were able to essentially get high. That's what it is. Let's call it what it is, off of this plant. And this was 500 years ago.
And this was the first cannabis prohibition.
This is the first cannabis. And this is where the words marijuana and various others, I know there was different things, came from. And one of the most fascinating things that I was able to find after talking to you and while I was researching all of this was the 1846 Pharmacopoeia Mexicana. And in here, there's two things. You first see marijuana, M-A-R-I-G-U-A-N-A, and then it says see Rosa Maria. So could you dive into, I understand marijuana, but Rosa Maria, you mentioned another aspect of Maria previously. Could you say that again?
So Doña Maria.
Doña Maria. So what is the difference from Rosa Maria?
These are really sort of just synonyms, right? Okay. And they might actually refer to regional specificity, where one indigenous communities or different communities would have employed terms that are very similar around the Maria sort of taxonomy. Okay. But in one case, you get like Maria and Juana turned into marijuana, right? And then in another case, you have Doña Maria or Rosa Maria, right? And Rosa implying flower, right, or a rose. To clear up some of that sort of distinction, right?
And you can tell that they're synonyms because you can see right next to Rosa Maria is Cánamo, and Cánamo is would you consider Mexican or Spanish term for cannabis?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's
Specifically
more-
Mexican.
It's Mexican,
though.
right? It's
Yeah.
like Cannamo is a Mexican term for cannabis, and so, but it's like, okay, but here's the deal. This is when I had to come to Jesus, where I was like, whoa. I've taught people for 10 years that the word marijuana is bad because of only the history that I knew, which was in the US in the 1930s.
Yeah.
I was completely unaware of this history and this story. And when you brought this to my attention, and when you see this works and this is legit information, what happened to me inside was I was like, oh my God, the word marijuana is not only not bad, it's really beautiful.
It's a celebration.
It's a celebration of going around a cannabis prohibition and allowing your indigenous species to have contact with plants that you have a relationship with because you just made your, the people above you giving your prohibition, you tricked them that it was something
it's
Christian.
so clever.
That
It's so clever.
Using the term Mary by calling it marijuana, and that's how they got away with it.
Yeah.
And because
500 years ago.
because that's true, and this is my question for you is, how this works is we have an option where for all the people who want to make the word marijuana racist, they can do that by considering it so.
And
by
using it in that
by,
racist
by
context,
only
like you
using
said,
it in a racist context and by looking at it from its 1930s history. And then on the other side of the option is you could choose to say, now that I have more information about the word marijuana, I think it's really cool. I think it's beautiful. Maybe we should celebrate the word because right now we're pushing through our cannabis prohibition and the word marijuana isn't bad. And here was the number one thing that just clicked for me. Thinking, I was like, is the word marijuana really racist? I was like, you know what? I've never heard anybody call anybody a marijuana. Not in the U.S.
But
in Mexico,
it
can be
but
used as a negative connotation.
But what's interesting
Marijuana.
is we live in a time where we are constantly told that this is a bad word, and a marijuano in Mexico is like saying you're a pothead or a stoner. I love it when people call me a pothead or a stoner. I'm like, yeah, look what I'm doing with my life. I am a pothead. Thank you very much.
Yep.
So what would you like to see? Right now, people are trying to erase marijuana.
And it's actually working. In Oregon,
Yeah.
they're trying to get it out of legislation because of their misunderstanding.
But Mexico calls it medical marijuana as well. But this is well before Mexico, well before the United States, well before Harry Anslinger in the 1930s and the prohibition the United States went through. So what do you think needs to happen with this word?
I think, part of it is, to your point also, that you also have individuals that were likely to take this course in Latin America, right, or in Mexico, as we see countries in Latin America start to have their own legal programs, whether they're medical or just adult use, right, in general, is that the term marihuano or marijuana, to talk about an individual, those are heavily rooted in what comes after this colonial period in terms of like what's happening when the Mexican pharmacopoeia is being developed, is that there's also this class dynamic that takes place in Mexico, because in Mexico you have this sort of like racial class divide that also emerges, where many of the indigenous people that allowed for us to have a term like marijuana, or indigenous descent people, really stand at a different sort of class level than the elites in Mexico. And part of what happened in the late 19th, early 20th century, which Isaac Campos Costero, who's a historian out of University of Cincinnati, has done a really great work around, is showing that much of what Harry Anslinger used to argue that marijuana needed to be prohibited actually came from the elites in Mexico, saying these low-class people are consuming this substance that we don't like, right?
That I did. We didn't talk about that before. That's.
And I think that to many of my Latin American counterparts is also it's not just having to reconcile the fact that the U.S. has a problematic history with how it's treated the term and how it's treating the substance itself in the US because of its association with what we might call Mexicans. That in the Mexican context, it's a really big problem in the Latin American context, where you see the fact that the policing of that plant for so long was heavily rooted around this this class divide, right, between elites and sort of the more popular classes, right?
So elites and indigenous. Would that be a more accurate way? Because so it's not a Mexican thing. It's Mexicans against Mexicans in this, but it's elite versus
or is it more
indigenous.
Spanish-blooded people versus more indigenous-blooded people, and there being a class difference based on almost
culture,
not race, but ethnic difference.
Yeah, and that's one of those, being able to reclaim the term marijuana as we see in this hemisphere, right? The incorporation of this plant into a legal framework is that it allows us to face our problematic past in the US around why we thought this plant needed to be prohibited because this population was using it, right? There was nothing wrong with the term. It was the fact that we didn't like Mexican people in the US.
Or black people swinging their hips with jazz music. Anyone who wasn't white was using this, and therefore, and non-whites are less than whites, and therefore marijuana would help you become less than of a person.
Yeah, and I think if we're honest with ourselves of what's happening in the industry is, silencing that past also silences what's taking place in the industry, where we're trying to see a push for this sort of social justice framework of being able to bring in individuals that have been most heavily policed using marijuana prohibition into the industry, right? I think marijuana included in this taxonomy is a reminder of the fact that we have had this problematic history with this plant.
And no one knows this. Did you know any of this?
I did to an extent. I didn't know it to that extreme, but
does it make you feel proud of the word?
I don't know that it's necessarily, it's still a hard, controversial thing for me to use, kind of thing, because we've been told so much that we can't use it, it's bad. But whenever you say, oh, by silencing our usage of the word marijuana, we're silencing the entire fact that happened, I'm like, okay, well then we should be rejoicing that word. We should be.
It at least deserves a conversation.
Yeah.
Well, and I think that when we talked about this, just as cannabis as a whole, regardless of whether it's hemp or ganja or marijuana or all these different names for it, cannabis and everything beneath of it was stigmatized in our culture, starting in the early 1900s, but really in the 1930s. And it was made negative. It was demonized. Right now, through everything that's happening with legalization, we are destigmatizing cannabis, okay? We are making it positive. We are making it normal again. And I think that same thing needs to happen with this word, in the sense of the word itself has this beautiful culture and this history and the origins and and the cleverness. And it was then stigmatized. So now let's destigmatize marijuana and let's celebrate it and educate everyone about where it comes from and what it means, and celebrate its past and its history, and not deny some of the negative aspects that came along with this 500-year-old word.
And let's move forward with the word via interpening methodology, because getting back to class, the way that you separate the difference between a hemp type and a non-hemp type is a marijuana type. Because marijuana and hemp are not the same thing, but they're both cannabis. Okay, so hemp and marijuana are hybridized, domesticated plant types from the cannabis species that have different phenotypes and chemotypes, which we'll get into later. So they're different. And because now we know, thank you, by the way.
Thank you.
Thank you for helping us understand our cannabis misinformation. Now that I better understand, took me about a week to get over 20 years of thinking this way. Now that I've gotten over that hump, it's like, guess what, people? We can make cannabis really simple. It's not indica. It's not a sativa. Because it's a domesticated hybrid and it's super complicated, tell you what, let's just make it really easy. If you're looking at a plant right here and it's got narrow leaves and you know it's the kind that gets you high, it's marijuana, and that's an NLM. That's a narrow-leafed marijuana plant. The same way that a narrow-leaf hemp plant would be an NLH, just like Rob Clark and Mark Merlin gave to the cannabis world. NLH makes perfect sense.
But now when we talk about hemp,
NLD does not make sense because they're both drugs.
Exactly. Yeah. But now when we talk about hemp, we know that we're not omitting the fact that CBD and cannabidiol is a medicine. It's a drug. So we have our medicine, psychoactive, non-mind altering,
non-intoxicating.
That's not going to make you feel high over here for food, fuel, fiber, and medicine. And now we have marijuana. And we all know why we really enjoy marijuana. Because it gets you high. But it's also a medicine. We enjoy getting high off of it, but there are various levels of being high, but it is a medicine. So, and we're celebrating this culture and the indigenous people and its history and its past, and we're thankful that you came to explain this to everyone. And
thanks for coming to class to be a student, but also a professor.